Hello, I'm Robert, and you're welcome here in my business shop. On today's episode of What's on My Workbench, it's stitching and lacing chisels. Easy for you to say. I'm going to talk about the ones I use, why I use them, and just some tips that I learned along the way. I hope you're having a great day. All right, so to get started, I've laid out here the collection of stitching chisels and lacing chisels I have, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between them and how I've gotten to the point where I'm at with these tools. So as you know, I use Tiger Ritza thread on almost everything that I make, and there are other good thread companies out there. I do have some Maine thread up there from Maine, and it's good. I've used some of the lighter weight stuff, and I ended up actually breaking it, pulling my stitches, and I'm probably pulling them too tight. But the Tiger Ritza is strong enough that you're not going to, I don't believe you're going to break it unless you have it tied down on one end and wrapped around a piece of wood, because you'll probably pull it through your fingers or through the leather before you would break that thread. So it's a very tough thread, and I use two different thicknesses of the Tiger Ritza thread for the majority of what I do. So I've laid out here my collection, and I'm going to work kind of backwards into the one that I use the most. So the very first chisels I ever purchased was these two here from Tandy Leather, and these are diamond chisels, and they're a fairly lightweight, and they're 2 millimeter is what they're listed as, 2 millimeter. And I'm not sure the way they measure it must be different than some, because that 2 millimeter lines up on this weaver set that's 4 millimeter. And when I bought these here, and I used these some, and I was looking for something a little different, so I ordered these next, the weaver 4 millimeter. And when I got them, I'm like, oh, pretty much exactly what I had before. The Tandy set's a little bit thinner, and the weaver set's a little bit thicker here. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So I purchased those, and I've used them some, but I haven't used them all that much. So when I started buying the weaver chisels, I bought them like some people buy tools. It was a price point. I believe I paid $22 for this set of chisels, and I've made several hundred belts with this set here, and with this 5 millimeter 6-hole, the most. And you can even see they must be brass, or they've got a brass plating underneath the nickel plating, because I've worn through it, but I've not worn completely through it just by doing leather. I have used this on the buffing wheel to polish it up so that it enters and exits the leather easier. And so that was the next one I bought. And then I was at the Prescott, Arizona leather show last year and talked to Aaron Heiser. And this is a set that they sell, and it has their name on it here, Maker's Leather Supply. And I bought it because it was a little bit of a thinner needle on them. And you can see it's quite a bit difference here. I don't know if it's focused in the right place or not, but these are probably a little more than half the thickness of the weaver set here. And then obviously it's got, I don't know if there's 10 tines, 11 tines, whatever it is on there. So I bought these, and I was concerned when I bought them because I was afraid that since they're so much smaller that they might bend. And I really haven't used them enough to know if that's a problem. If you watch me use a stitching chisel, I typically work on top of a cutting board with a scrap piece of leather, and then the leather that I am stitching. And I do that because when I go through here into the other leather and then I tip to pull it out, I feel like there's less likelihood of me bending these tines that are driven potentially into the mat. Now, you don't need to drive through any further than what it takes to puncture the other side, and that's good practice to not go any further than that. And some people will use these just to mark the spots, and then they'll come back through with an awl and finish it out. That's okay if that's the way you want to do it. I'm just explaining where I'm at with the ones that I have. So I haven't used them a whole lot. And I'll come back to that in just a second here. And then I have my lacing chisels over here. And I had another video and I talked about stitching chisels, and someone's like, hey buddy, that's a lacing chisel. It is. These are lacing chisels. I don't use them for lacing, I use them for stitching. And I'll explain why here in a second. So this is the Tandy set that I bought. I bought these first, and then I bought these here from Weaver. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is what Chuck Dorset uses for most of his. And I'm going to show you, I think, why he does that. So one thing I don't like about the lacing chisels is they don't come to a point. They come to knife edges here. Get this to focus. And these diamond chisels, they'll cut some of the leather, but they more separate the leather. And this definitely cuts the leather when you drive that through. So now I have, definitely cut leather here as I went down through there. Now, if I'm doing a belt and that's along the edge, I don't think that that's really that big of a deal. And what I mean by that is you're going this way with the leather, the length of the belt, and you could completely sever that. It wouldn't look very good. And it's really not going to take away much of the strength of the belt the long ways. I think that makes sense. I've laid out here, and I want to talk a little bit about back on the thread. This is the 0.06 and this is the 0.08. Not a big difference between the two of those in the size, but it does make a difference on how they look. So one of the things I guess I want to make sure that I don't miss making this point, and I went through and stitched all this. These are all with the 0.06. These are all with the 0.08 thread. I believe that as you get into the tighter pattern that you should go to a finer or thinner thread because it helps the pattern be more defined. If you look at the 0.08 on the 5mm stitching chisel here, I think that's a nice looking stitch, but I think that that same thickness of thread on the 4mm, it begins to look too crowded. That's why I believe that on the 4mm that I would use typically the 0.06 thread, and it might even look more defined, or I'm sure it would look more defined if you had a thinner thread yet. This is the lacing chisel, and I bought the lacing chisel because to me, this diamond, and I really love the look of the diamond stitching, it to me has got a little more of a Western flair. And the straight line I can get out of the lacing chisel, to me, looks more contemporary. And so I've made some belts for people that, hey, I want to wear this with a suit in a dressier environment. And so I have used the lacing chisel here. And this here is labeled as a 2.5 to 3mm lacing chisel, which is the size of the slot that it makes. And that's important because you match that up to the size of the lacing. But I'm not using it in the lacing at this point. I'm using it in the stitching. And so with this chisel through here, this is the 0.06 thread and the 0.08 thread. And to me, this helps define the stitch a little bit more. This looks like really just kind of one continuous black line, which to me got a little more of a contemporary flair to it. So I want to show you how I use them. I think you guys have watched on most of my videos. But they work very easily as I tap down through here. And like I said, you don't have to drive it further than what it takes to puncture the other side. The further you drive it in, the harder it is to get out. And the one problem with using the chisels to create the holes is if you get multiple layers built up, you drive that in there like that, it's not easy to get out of there. So that's the 5mm. This is the 4mm. So essentially the same process, but as you can see, you've got a tighter hole pattern. They do make, I think they make a 3mm as well. It's been a while since I've looked at the chisels there on Weaver's site, and they make a 6mm as well, so bigger yet. And then this is Aaron Heiser's, and this is one reason why I bought it, is because you can really get down through here quicker with those. And the one thing that I have found is that it is a thinner hole that's down through there, and it does make the stitching a little bit harder because it's a smaller hole you're passing both the needles through. Okay, so that's the holes and the stitching. I want to show you another thing here. Let me reset up here. So the next thing I want to show you is, to me, a little bit of housekeeping when it comes to the stitching. And what I mean by that is that when you finish doing the stitching, I think they look, pretty good at this point. But if you take the time to, people call it hammering them down, it's more of tapping. And you don't have to have an expensive hammer like that. This is a ball peen hammer that I've used quite a bit. I used it more before I purchased this one here. And this is a very old ball peen hammer. I just polished up the face of it. And it doesn't take a whole lot of an impact here, but if you tap it down, once you've tapped down the thread, it does a couple things. And it defines that stitch a little bit more. So it flattens it out. It sets it below a large percent of the thread below the surface of the leather. So if it's a wear area, it's not going to have as much of an impact on that thread. And this thread is very wear resistant. Now, I was talking about my stitching in my lap over there. And maybe I'm, getting too particular here. But when you look at these stitches here, I think they look pretty consistent from one to the next. And these actually came out pretty good. But if you look at them, you'll see that I've kind of got the diamond look, and then it's more of a straight run. There's a diamond look, a straight run, a diamond, diamond. And it's more evident if you're going around a curve, because it's like, I call it sets of two that look a certain way. So if you want your stitches to look more consistent, if you find a way to hold it so that you're able to replicate every stitch the same way, it's just harder to do in your lap. Plus, it's quicker if it's in the stitching pony over there as well. So anyway, maybe this is more detailed than you wanted, but I do get questions fairly often about where I got the stitching chisels, how I use them, my stitching, the thread. The needles I use are John James needles. When I first started working, I had a set of less expensive needles, and I broke the eye off of several of them with my stitching. And then I purchased the John James needles after watching Chuck Dorset on his channel. And when I bought them, I bought a set, and I really liked how they were. Later on, they were on sale, and I bought several packages of them. And believe it or not, I break like 1 or 2 needles per year. So I'm still working with the same set of needles that I put in that little pin cushion that I made probably 2 years ago. And you can see I've broke probably, there's 3 in that one. I've broke like 3 needles in almost 2 years. Well, that's it. I hope that my explanation of my stitching chisels and my process for stitching didn't bore you too much, how I got from where I started to where I'm at. My hopes is that it helps someone else out there looking at the stitches. I know when I first started stitching, I've still got one of the belts I made in the gunslinger pattern. It was a black belt with white stitching I was making for somebody, and I didn't like how the stitches came out, and it had a lot to do with making sure that I replicated the stitch from one to the next so that it was consistent. It didn't look consistent, and so now it's my belt. It's a work belt. Anyway, I hope you're having a great day. Please like, share, and subscribe.